All right. And, okay, now that I've gone ahead and moved all that stuff around, I am officially here. And good evening and pleasant Sunday to all of you. I hope you're doing well out there, or as well as can be done under the circumstances. For First off, just a slight apology for making you all watch me doing something that had nothing to do with you for a moment. Well, it actually did, in the sense that I was posting stuff so that other people could come see this, because I still haven't entirely figured out how this all works yet. I mean, I have, but I haven't, if you know what I mean. Anyway, scratch all that. Let's start over. Good to see you virtually, and I hope y'all are having as good a day as you possibly can have. At least here in California, the weather is good, and we technically are allowed to go out in it, as long as we don't see our shadow or the shadow of any other living human being, at which point we have to run back inside, like the groundhogs that we are. But that's not really a complaint. Could be a lot worse. And those of you who are quarantining with us or social distancing with us, thank you. We appreciate it. We've got people in our own family who have issues, health issues, and definitely need the protection of the community and people not doing anything too aggressively stupid. I got nothing against stupid. It's aggressively stupid that worries me sometimes. Not that I've never been aggressively stupid myself, but of course it was a long, long time ago. Uh, Speaking of long, long time ago, I am getting to that point where I am looking back at things like the story I'm going to read tonight, and realizing that things that I wrote in what seems to me like the middle or even the later part of my career, stories like that or books like that are, now older than many of my readers and listeners. And this story I'm going to read tonight is something in that category, I guess, since it's going on 25 years old, this story. It was originally written for an odd anthology called David Copperfield Beyond Imagination, and it was an anthology put together by my dear, much missed friend. She was friends to a lot of us in the field, Janet Berliner, and she got a hold of a very, very fine array of writers, people like Greg Bear and Anne McCaffrey, and Gaiman's in there, and a whole bunch of folk. Karen Joy Fowler, all kinds of really good writers who wrote stories for this anthology, with magic as the premise, although as you'll see, and my story is actually an example of it, the magic is not exactly what you always expect, and it's certainly not necessarily all fantasy magic in this anthology. But anyway, so this anthology came out in like 1996, when Deborah and I had just moved to America, which of course is where I'm from, but it was Deb's first time living in America as compared to visiting. So it was quite a while ago now. Since then, we've had children and a couple of houses. Well, only one house at a time. But a lot of things have happened since then. So it's kind of interesting to go back and revisit it. Some things have not changed, though, and I think you will appreciate the fact that some things are timeless. And well, I don't want to give away any more of the story than that. So I will be reading in just a minute, and when I do that, you are all welcome to send me things. I'll try to look through. I see lots of friends. I see Mahmoud and Cliff and Sherry. I feel like Miss Nancy from Romper Room looking through her mirror. There, that if I didn't date myself with the date of my story, I've certainly dated myself with that. And Nancy and Alexis and Jerry and Thaddeus and Neil and all kinds of cool people that I don't have time to read all the names, but they're all saying hello here. Rick, I haven't seen Rick for a long, long time. So anyway, just wanted to say I appreciate everybody hanging out. I'm very much happy to be able to do this. You know, I always love a captive audience, and the fact that the entire world is now my captive audience, helpless to escape me, makes me super, super happy. Anyway, so this is a longish story, so I'm going to start reading it pretty quick. But if you do have any questions, put question or something in the at the beginning of the heading, and I will have a look through the comments after I finish and do my best to ask whatever questions people might have, because that will be the easiest way for me to do it. Anyway, I am not reading the story from the original anthology because I'm damned after 25 years if I know where my copy of that anthology is. So I'm reading another one from the very best of Tad Williams, which is published by Tachyon, of course. Yes, okay. I couldn't remember if it was Tachyon or Subterranean. The lovely folks at Tachyon, who are some of my very favorites. The original anthology for which it was commissioned was, God, I don't remember who did it here, but it was, I mean, I remember who did it, but I don't remember who published it. But it was David Copperfield's Beyond Imagination, which was actually his second anthology, neither of which did David had much to do with, I don't think. I think in both cases it was, these were editor driven. So anyway, I am going to read a story titled The Stuff That Dreams Are Made Of. And yes, Shakespeare enthusiasts, completists, and finicky buggers, I know that that is not the actual quote. From Shakespeare's The Tempest, believe me, I know it's the stuff that dreams are made on, but the title quotes another character who is not expected to know what the actual precise phrasing is. So anyway, I'm going to read you this story, and if you want to send a question, please do, and I will do my best to answer it when I finish it. So this story, about which you don't really need to know anything because it's all pretty apparent right away, again, is called The Stuff That Dreams Are Made Of. Okay, I admit it. If a guy wants to get drunk in the middle of a weekday afternoon, he should have a lock on his office door. Usually Tilly runs interference for me, but this day of all days, she'd left early to take her mother in to have her braces loosened. Retired ladies who get a yen for late life working on should give me a pain anyway. I told Tilly her mom's gums were too weak for such foolishness, but who listens to me? Anyway, Tilly is usually out there behind the reception desk to protect me. I don't pay her all that much, but somehow, despite the fairly small difference in our ages, I bring out some grumpy but stalwart mother bear reflex in her. Actually, that describes pretty well. Whoops, sorry, I'm going to put my glasses on. Actually, that describes her pretty well. Any bill collector who's ever seen an angry Tilly come out from behind her desk, her bulky cable knit sweater and long polished nails suggesting a she-grizzly charging out of a cave will know exactly what I mean. If Tilly moved in with Smokey the Bear, every forest arsonist in the country would move to Mexico. Sadly, there was no lock, and for once no Tilly to play what's-his-name at the bridge. Thus, the fairly attractive blonde woman, finding the door to my inner office open, wandered in and discovered me in a more or less horizontal position on the carpet. I stared at her ankles for a moment or two. perfectly nice ankles, but because of all the blood that had run to one side of my head, I wasn't really in optimum viewing mood. I said at last. Excuse me, I'm just looking for a contact lens. I would have been more convincing if my face hadn't been pressed too closely against the carpet to locate anything on a larger scale than the subatomic. And I'm looking for Dalton Pinard, she said, otherwise known as Pinardo the Magnificent. See anybody by that name down there among the contact lenses? She had a voice that, while not harsh, was perfectly designed to make 10-year-old boys goofing in the back of a classroom cringe, or to make drunken magicians feel like brewery vat scum. If she wasn't a teacher, she'd missed her calling. I have a note from a doctor that says I'm allergic to sarcasm, I growled. If you don't want a whopping lawsuit on your hands, you'd better leave. Admittedly, I was still at a slight conversational disadvantage. This riposte would have been more telling if it hadn't been spoken through a mouthful of carpet fuzz. But how can you expect someone who's just finished off his 10th Rolling Rock to be both witty and vertical? I'm not going to go away, Mr. Pinard. I'm here about something very important, so you just might as well stop these shenanigans. I winced. Only a woman who thinks that 2 pink gins at an educational conference buffet evening constitutes wild living would dismiss something of the profound masculine significance of a solo drunk as shenanigans. However, she had already ruined my mood, so I began the somewhat complicated process of getting into my chair. I made it without too much trouble. I'd be saying a permanent goodbye to the office soon anyway, so what difference did a few spilled ashtrays make? I was buoyed slightly by the knowledge that, however irritating this woman might be right now, at least she wouldn't be around for the hangover. Not that she was unpleasant to look at, except for a slightly sour look around the mouth, which turned out to be temporary, and a pair of glasses that belonged on one of those old women who wears garden gloves to play the slot machines. She actually looked pretty damn good. She had a slight tendency to go in and out of focus, but I suspected that might have something to do with what I'd had for lunch. Well, I said brightly, once I had achieved an upright position. I paused to scrabble beside the chair rollers for one of the cigarette butts that still had a good amount of white left on it. Well, what can I do for you, Miss? It's Ms., first of all, Ms. Emily Heltenbacher, and I'm increasingly less sure that you can do anything for me at all. But my father sent me to you, and I'm taking him at his word, for about another 45 seconds, anyway. I hadn't managed to get my lighter going in 3 tries, so I set it down in a way that suggested I had merely been gauging the length of spark for some perfectly normal scientific purpose. Heltenbacher. Wasn't that Charlie Helton's real name? I'm his daughter. Oh. Something kicked a little inside me. In all the years I knew Charlie, I had never met his only child, who had been raised by her mother after she and Charlie divorced. It was too bad we were finally meeting when I was, well, like I was at the moment. I heard about your dad last week. I'm really sorry. He was a great guy. He was. I miss him very much. She didn't unfreeze, but she did lower herself into the chair opposite me, showing a bit more leg than one expected from a schoolteacher type, which inspired me to essay the cigarette lighter again. Oh, for God's sake, she said at last, then pulled a lighter out of her purse and set it blazing under my nose. Half the foreshortened cigarette disappeared on my first draw as she dropped the lighter back in her bag. Emily Heltenbacher struck me as the kind of woman who might tie your shoes for you if you fumbled with the laces too long. So, Charlie sent you to me? I leaned back and managed finally to merge the 2 Ms. Heltenbachers into one, which made for more effective conversation. She had a rather nice face, actually, with a strong nose and good cheekbones. Did you want to book me for the memorial service or something? I'd be honored. I'm sure I could put together a little tribute of some kind. Actually, I was trying desperately to decide which of the tricks I did at the children's parties, which constituted most of my business, would be least embarrassing to perform in front of a gathering of my fellow professionals. I couldn't picture the leading lights of the magic world getting too worked up about balloon animals. No, it's not for the memorial service. We've already had that just for the family. I want to talk to you about something else. Did you hear what happened to him? I couldn't think of any immediate response except to nod. In fact, it was despondency over Charlie's passing and the awareness of mortality that comes with such things that had been a large part of the reason for my little afternoon session. Maybe not as large a part as the foreclosure notice on the office I had received that morning, but it had certainly fueled my melancholy. What can you say about an old friend for whom the basket and sabers trick went so dreadfully wrong? That at a time when he was down on his luck financially and on a day when he happened to be practicing without an assistant, it looks a little like your old friend may have been a suicide? Of course, a honed steel saber sounds more like a murder weapon than a tool for self-slaughter, and most people don't choose to bow out inside a 4-foot rattan hamper, but the door to his workroom was locked, and the only key was in Charlie's blood-soaked pocket. According to the respectable papers, he was working inside the basket and somehow must have turned the wrong way. The sharp blade had sliced his carotid artery just beneath the ear. Accident was the verdict most of them came up with, and the police, perhaps tactfully, agreed. Some of the lower-rent tabloids did hint at suicide and ran lurid pictures of the crime scene under headlines like "The Final Trick" and "Basket of Blood." I would heap even more scorn on such journals, except my most recent interview, only 2 years before, had been courtesy of Astrology and Detective Gazette, which shows they are not entirely without discernment. "Yeah, I read about it," I said at last. I was really shaken up. A horrible accident. It was murder. "Phone the time, ladies," announced the hour with less certainty. I beg your pardon? Murder." She reached into her bag, but this time she didn't produce a lighter. The envelope hit my desk with the loud smack of a card trick going wrong. "I went to see the lawyer yesterday. I expected Dad to be broke." I was suddenly interested. She was here to hire me for something, even if I didn't know what. "And you were wrong?" "No, I was exactly right. His net assets are a few hundred moth-eaten magic books, some tattered posters, a few old props, and an overdue bill for rental of his top hat. And that envelope. But I expected to receive something else too, and I didn't get it." I was already reaching for the envelope. She stilled me with a glance. "Yeah, just like they say in books. And if any of you has ever received a note in class illustrated with a dirty cartoon of your teacher and looked up to find her standing over you, you'll know what I mean. Real rabbit in the headlights stuff." You said you didn't get something you expected?" Dad had been writing his memoirs for years. He wouldn't let me read them, but I saw the manuscript lots of times. When I didn't find it around the house after... For a brief moment, her composure slipped. I looked away, half out of sympathy, half to escape the momentarily suspended Gorgon stare. She cleared her throat. "When I couldn't find it, I assumed he'd given it to his lawyer for safekeeping. He'd fired his agent years earlier, and he doesn't talk to Mom, so it couldn't be with anyone else. But the lawyer didn't know anything about it. It's just vanished. And here's the suspicious part. There was a lot of interest in that manuscript, especially from some of Dad's rivals in the business. They were concerned that he might tell some tales they'd rather weren't made public." I straightened up. Repeated doses of her "sit up properly, class" voice were beginning to take a toll on my natural slouch. Also, the effects of my liquid lunch were wearing off. "Oh, listen, Ms. Heltenbacher, I'm not a cop, but that doesn't seem like grounds enough to suspect murder. I know you're not a cop. You're an out-of-work magician. Look in the envelope." "Hey, I have a nice little thing going with birthdays and bar mitzvahs, you know." That sort of defensive thrust works best when followed by a quick retreat, so I picked up the envelope. It had her name on it, written in an old man's shaky hand. The only thing inside was an old photograph, 2 rows of young men all dressed in top hats and tailcoats, with a placard in front of them reading, Savini's Magic Academy, Class of 48. 3 of the faces had been circled in ink. None of the 3 was Charlie himself. I discovered him smiling in the front row, looking like a young farm boy fresh off the bus, which, in 1948, as I recalled, he pretty much would have been. This doesn't mean anything to me, I said. How could it? I wasn't even born. Look on the back. On the flip side of the photo, that same shaky hand had scrawled across the top, if something happens to me or my book, investigate these 3. At the bottom, also in ink, but kind of faint, the same person had written, Trust Pinardo. Yes, it's all my dad's handwriting. It took me a while to find out who Pinardo was and to track you down. Apparently, you haven't been playing many of the big venues lately. She smiled, but I've seen more warmth from Chevrolet grill work. So far, my dad's judgment looks pretty awful, but I'm willing to give you a chance for his sake. I still think it's murder, and I do need assistance. I shook my head. Okay, your father was a friend, but we hadn't seen each other for a long time. Even granting that it's a murder, only for the sake of argument, what did he expect me to do, for Christ's sakes? Help me. My father suspected something about these 3 men who all went to the Magic Academy with him. His book has disappeared. I'm going to confront them, but I need somebody who understands this world. The facade slipped again, and I found myself watching her face move. The human woman, underneath that do-it-yourself sternness kit, was quite appealing. My mom and dad split up when I was little. I didn't grow up with him. I don't know anything about stage magic. I'm a teacher, for goodness sake. Aha! I said. What the hell does that mean? Nothing, really. I pondered. Okay, I don't buy any of this, but I'll do what I can. Charlie was a good guy, and he was there for me when I was starting out. I suppose that whatever I have, I owe to him. She said. Maybe I trusted you too fast. You've certainly got a pretty good murder motive right there. Very funny. We'd better discuss my fee because, as it turns out, I can help you already. I just recognized one of these guys. Quite pleased with myself, I pointed at a thin young man with a thin young mustache standing in the back row. His name is Fabrizio Ivoni, and he's working tonight at the Rabbit Club. My none too sumptuous personal quarters are a suite of rooms. Well, if a studio with a kitchenette and a bathroom constitutes a suite, over my place of business. Thus, it was easy enough to grab a bite to eat and a couple hours sleep, then shower and get back downstairs well before Ms. Heltenbacher returned to pick me up. If my head was starting to feel like someone was conducting folk dancing classes inside it, I suppose that was nobody's fault but my own. Tilly was again holding down the front desk, eating a takeout egg foo young and going over the books. She was frowning, and no surprise. Matching my income against my outgo was like trying to mend the Titanic with chewing gum and masking tape. Hey, you were supposed to have the day off. I scrabbled in the filing cabinet for the aspirin. How's your mom? Tilly gave me one of her looks. She'd probably noticed the pyramid of beer bottles I'd made on my desk. If I stayed away from here a whole day, this place would just disappear under the dust like Pompeii. Mom's fine. Her gums are still sore. I've been overheating the blender making her milkshakes all afternoon. She paused to contemplate a noodle that had fallen onto her sweater, where it lay like a python that had died climbing Everest. By the way, who the hell is Emily Heltenbacher? Client. I said it casually, although it was a word that had not been uttered within those walls for some time. Also Charlie Helton's daughter. Why? She left a message for you. Ah, poor old Charlie. That was a real shame. Anyway, she says she'll be here at 7 and you should wear a clean shirt. I did not dignify this with a reply. Oh, and 2 different reporters called. Someone from the Metropolitan and a guy from Defective Astronomer Gazette. Astrology and detective, I said absently, wondering what could have made me the center of such a media whirlwind. The Metropolitan was actually a rather high-toned organ. I mean, they only printed their car accident pictures in black and white. and they ran tiny disclaimers underneath the alien abduction stories. I swallowed a few more aspirin and went to meet the press. A couple of quick calls revealed that both had contacted me about the Charlie Helton mystery, aka the magical murder manuscript. Apparently, the missing book angle had been leaked by Charlie's lawyer and was developing into a fair bit of tabloid froth. Some hack from The Scrutinizer called while I was still working my way through the first two. By the time I had finished my bout of semi-official spokesmanship, not forgetting to remind them all that Pinard was spelled with two N's, but Pinardo, as in the Magnificent, with only one, Tilly leaned in the door to tell me my date was waiting. There is a certain hideous inevitability to what happens when Tilly meets one of my female clients, at least if that client is under 60 years of age. It is useless to protest that I have no romantic interest in them. Tilly only takes this as evidence of my hopelessly self-deluding nature. As far as she's concerned, any roughly nubile woman who has even the most cursory business relationship with me falls into one of two categories: shallow gold diggers prospecting in my admittedly rather tapped-out soil, or blindingly out of my league classy ladies over whom I am fated to make a dribbling fool of myself. Only the sheer lack of recent clients of any sort had caused me to forget this. Otherwise, I would have been sure to meet Charlie's daughter downstairs in front of the laundromat, at whatever cost the dignity. All unknowing, Emily Heltenbacher had greatly increased the likelihood of such a reaction by wearing a rather touchingly out-of-date cocktail frock for our nightclub sojourn. The black dress showed an interesting but not immodest amount of cleavage, so Tilly had immediately sized her up as a number one. "I'll just stick around for a while to keep out the repossession people," she informed me helpfully as I emerged. "Don't worry, boss. I won't let them take that urn with your mother's ashes like they did the last time you went bust." She turned to Emily. "Call me sentimental, but I think however far in debt someone is, those loan sharks should stick to reclaiming furniture, not late relations." I winced, not so much at the all-too-true reference to my financial state as at the unfortunate subject of dead relatives, but Emily appeared to take no notice of my assistant's faux pas. "What a loyal employee," she cooed, and I thought I detected a touch of acid beneath the sweetness. "She's clearly been with the firm forever. Well, she should still get back in time for Ovaltine in the evening news. Even if the repo men drop by tonight, it shouldn't take them long to collect this lot." Tilly raised an eyebrow in grudging approval. She liked an opponent who could return serve. Before some thundering new volley was delivered, I grabbed Emily's arm and pulled her toward the stairs. Did I mention that there's been a slight problem with the elevator lately?" "At least this shirt looks like it was ironed at some point," she said. "Mid-70s, maybe?" She was driving. Her style refuted my ideas of what a schoolteacher would be like behind the wheel, and in fact rather enlarged general concept of driving. Apparently many of the other motorists felt the same. We had traveled town through an 1812 overture of honking horns, squealing brakes, and occasional vivid remarks loud enough to be heard even through our rolled-up windows. I chose to ignore her comment about my shirt and concentrated instead on clinging to my seat with one hand while using the other to leaf through the autopsy report which Emily had somehow procured. Privately, I suspected a coroner's clerk with guilty schoolboy memories. Nothing in the report seemed to differ greatly from what I had read in the papers. Karl Marius Heltenbacher, a.k.a. Charlie Helton, had been in his early 60s but in good physical health. Death was due to exsanguination, the agent of same having been a large and very sharp steel sword of the type known as a cavalry saber. A few rough drawings showed the position of the body as it had been found inside the basket, and a note confirmed that paramedics had declared the victim dead at the scene. The verdict was death by misadventure, and both autopsy and summary report were signed by George Bridgewater, the county's coroner-in-chief. If anyone in authority suspected it was a murder, it certainly wasn't reflected in the official paperwork. "It sure looks like an accident," I said, wincing slightly as a pedestrian did a credible Baryshnikov impression in his haste to give Emily right of way through a crosswalk. "Of course it does. If you were going to murder someone and steal his manuscript to protect yourself, Mr. Pinard, wouldn't you want it to look like an accident? She said this with an air of such logical certainty that I was reminded of my firm conviction during my student years that all teachers were extraterrestrials. How fiendishly clever, I replied. I admit I said it quietly. I was saving my wittier ripostes until there was pavement under my feet again. I hadn't been to the Rabbit Club in a while, and was faintly depressed at the changes. I suppose on the salary the school board forked out, Emily didn't get out much, because she seemed quite taken with the place. Actually, set against the rather faded glories of the club, its heyday had roughly paralleled that of the Brooklyn Dodgers, she looked far more natural than me in my leather jacket and jeans. With her strapless cocktail dress and horn-rimmed glasses, she might have been sent over by central casting. As I mused, she said something I didn't quite catch, and I realized I had stopped in the middle of the aisle to admire her shoulders. I have always been a sucker for a faint dusting of freckles. I hurried her toward a booth. The show was not the sort to make anyone sit up and wonder, but the club was one of the few places left in town where young magic talent could get a start. Looking around the darkened room, I felt a certain nostalgia for my own rookie days. Over the following hours, we watched a succession of inexperienced prestidigitators fumble bouquets out of their sleeves and make coins jump across the back of their hands while hardly ever dropping them. I nursed a soda water, rewarded for my choice with a restrained smile from my companion, but Emily drank 2.5 glasses of champagne and applauded vigorously for one of the least sterling examples of the floating rings I'd ever seen. I decided sourly that the young, and rather irritatingly well-built magician's no-shirt-under-the-tux outfit had influenced her appreciation. After the break, during which the tiny house band wheezed through a couple of Glenn Miller numbers, Fabrizio Ivoni was announced. The headliner had not changed much since the last time I'd seen him. He was a little older, of course, but aren't we all? His patter was delivered with a certain old-world formality, and his slicked-down hair and tiny mustache made him seem a remnant of the previous century. Watching him work his effortless way through a good group of standard illusions, it was easy to forget we were living in an era of jumbo jets and computers and special effects movies. When he finished by producing a white dove from a flaming Chinese lacquer box, the smallish crowd gave him an enthusiastic ovation. I took Emily backstage on my arm. At this point, she was a wee bit unsteady on her pins, and quickly located the dressing room. Ivoni was putting his brilliantined hair, or at least the part that wasn't real, back in the box. "The world of illusion," said Emily, and giggled. I squeezed her wrist hard. "That was a splendid show, Mr. Ivoni. I don't know if you remember me. We worked a bill together in Vegas about 10 years ago at the Dunes, I think it was. Dalton Pinardo the Magnificent?" "Ah, of course." He looked me up and down and went back to taking off his makeup. He didn't look like he cared much one way or the other. "And this is my friend, Emily Heltenbacher." I took a breath and decided to go for the direct approach. "Her father was Charlie Helton." A plucked eyebrow crept up that eggshell dome of the forehead. "Ah, I was sad to hear about him." He sounded about as sorry as he'd seemed glad to see me again. "We were wondering if you might know something about the book he was writing," said Emily. "Somebody stole it." She gifted him with a dazzling smile. It was a good smile, but I couldn't match it since I was wincing at her sledgehammer approach. The old magician gave her a look he probably used more often on sidewalk dog surprises. "I heard it was full of slanders. I am not unhappy to hear it has been stolen, if that were to be the end of it. But I have no doubt it will soon appear in the gutter press. If you are asking me if I know anything about this sordid affair, the answer is no. If you are insinuating I had anything to do with the theft, then you will be speaking to my lawyer." I trod, ever so gently, on Emily's foot, preparing to steer the conversation in a friendlier direction. My new initiative was delayed somewhat by the wicked elbow she gave me back in the solar plexus. When I could breathe again, I said, "No, Mr. Ivoni, we don't think any such thing. We were just hoping that you might be able to tell us anything you know about Charlie's relationship with other magicians. So we can decide once and for all if there's anything sinister in the disappearance. But you, sir, are, of course, above suspicion. He stared at me for a moment, and I wondered if I'd overdone it. The cold cream was caked in his wizened features like a bad plastering job. I would never harm anyone, he said at last. But I must say that I did not like your father, young woman. Even in the Savini Academy. Yes, we studied together. He was never serious. He and his friends, they were all the time laughing in the back row. And who were his friends in the academy? Ivoni shrugged. I do not remember. Pranksters, gutter snipes, not true artists. He was the only one of that sort who graduated. I let out a breath. So if Charlie had known the other two men at school, they hadn't been close chums. Ivoni was still in full indignant flow. He did not show the respect for our great tradition, not then, not later. Always he was making jokes, even when he was on the stage. Silly riddles and stories, little puzzles, as though he were performing to entertain children. He placed his toupee in its box as carefully as if it were the relic of some dead saint, and solemnly shut the lid. I have appeared before the crowned heads of Europe and Asia in my day, and never once on the stage have I made a joke. I didn't doubt him for a moment. I wish you'd kept your mouth shut, I said. It didn't come across as forceful as it sounds, since Emily had already pulled me away from the curb and I was frantically groping on the floor for the other half of my seatbelt. Don't be rude. You're an employee, remember? Besides, I didn't like him. He was a very small-souled man. I rolled my eyes. That's not the point. After you'd just gone and blurted that out about the book, he wasn't going to give anything away. I couldn't very well ask him where he'd been when your dad died, for instance. Emily made a face. But I know that already. He was on stage at the Rabbit Club. He's been performing there for weeks. I checked. What? I checked. I called the Performing Artists Guild after you told me his name. He was working the night my father was killed. I stared. The trained fingers I had once insured. Okay, only for $5,000 on a $26 monthly premium. It was a publicity stunt. Itched to throttle her, or at least to pull those stupid glasses off and see if she drove any better without them. He was working? Fabrizio Ivoni, the supposed murderer, was on the other side of town pulling coins out of people's noses when your father died? Yes, I just told you that. I called the guild. Don't get so defensive. I didn't expect you to do all the work, just the stuff that needed expert knowledge. I threw myself back against my seat, but our sudden stop in the middle of an intersection catapulted me forward again, microseconds later. I can't believe I'm wasting my time on this nonsense, I growled. The light had turned green again, but Charlie's daughter seemed to be waiting for a shade she liked better. The point I'm making, Emily, is that Fabrizio Ivoni has an alibi. As in, release this honest citizen, Sergeant. He's got an alibi. She shook her head pityingly, as though I had just urged her to buy heavily into flat earth futures. Haven't you ever heard of hired killers? We lurched into motion just as the light turned red once more. You just can't trust clients. It happens every time. They come through your door, wave money under your nose, and make lots of promises, then boom! Next thing you know, that little party you were hired for turns out to be a smoker, and you're doing card tricks for a bunch of surly drunks because the stripper hasn't showed up. Yeah, I'm a little bitter. When you've been around this business, as long as I have, you get that way. You splurge on a Tibetan mystery box some guy swears is just like new, and when you get it home, it's riddled with woodworm. You order a shipment of doves from the mail order house, and they forget to punch air holes in the box. And women! Oh, don't even talk to me about women. I can't count the number of times I've been standing around backstage somewhere 10 minutes before curtain for the Sunday matinee, arguing on the phone with my latest assistant, who isn't there because she's got water bloat, or her boyfriend's in jail, or because I introduced her as the lovely Zelda the night before and her name's really Zora. Pull over, I snapped, and try using the brakes instead of just glancing off streetlights until the car stops. She followed my advice. In fact, she used the brakes so enthusiastically that I wore a very accurate impression of the dashboard grain on my forehead for hours afterward. "Get the hell out then," she said. "I knew you were a loser from the moment I first saw you crawling around on the floor." "Well, I may be a loser, but you hired me." The effect of my clever comeback and sweeping exit was diminished slightly by the fact that I hadn't unbuckled the safety belt. The ensuing struggle also allowed me time to cool down a little. After I finally worked free and fell onto the sidewalk, I turned to look back, expecting to see the tears of a helpless woman or perhaps a momentary glimpse of Charlie's features in hers, which would remind me of the old friend whose desperate daughter this was. Emily wasn't such a bad kid, really. I was half ready to have my gruff masculine heart melted. "Shut the damn door," she snarled. If there were any tears, I definitely missed them. She did manage to run over my foot as she drove away. I suppose I shouldn't have been too surprised, I reflected as I limped home. I had fallen out with Emily's father much the same way. Nobody in the whole damn family could admit they were wrong. Charlie Helton had been a wonderful guy, my mentor in the business. He'd helped me find my first agent and had shared many of his hard-won secrets with me, giving me a boost that few young performers got. He'd been everywhere almost, had done things few other people had even read about, and could tell you stories that would make your eyes pop out. But he could be difficult and stubborn at times, and as Ivoni had so vividly remembered, he had a rather strange idea of fun. After he and Emily's mother had broken up, he had lived a solitary life. I hadn't even known he'd been married until several years into our friendship. And like a lot of bachelor types, his life revolved around what other people might consider pretty useless hobbies. In Charlie's case, there were two: puzzle and practical jokes. Unfortunately, not all of his jokes were funny, at least to the victims. One such, a particularly complicated operation, had involved my booking for a show at a naturist colony in the Catskills. I was very uncertain since it required me to perform naked except for cape and top hat. But Charlie convinced me that a lot of big entertainment people were weekend nudists and that I would be bound to make some great contacts. When I arrived at the resort the night of the show, I was met backstage by the club manager, who was definitely naked. He was a big fat guy of about 50, and knowing that people like him could do it helped me wrestle down my inhibitions. See, when you perform, if the stage lights are bright enough, you hardly see the audience anyway. The manager assured me that it would be just like doing a show in my own bedroom. So I stripped, squared my shoulders, calmed my quivering stomach, and marched out onto the stage. And no, it wasn't a nudist colony, of course. It was a regular Catskills resort, median audience age, almost dead and holding. The club manager was a confederate of Charlie's, who'd taken off as soon as he'd finished his part of the scam. The audience was not amused. Neither was I. The sad thing was, Charlie and I fell out not because of that prank itself, nasty as it had been, but because I refused to admit there was anything humorous about it. I guess his pride was wounded. He thought he was the funniest guy in the world. Things started to go downhill for me after that, but not because of my premature venture into performance art. I just caught some bad breaks. Okay, a lot of bad breaks. Maybe Charlie had been feeling guilty about our parting all those years, and about not being around to help me get back on my feet. Maybe that was why he told his daughter that if she ever needed someone to trust, to seek me out. There was something else to consider, I suddenly realized. On the infinitesimal chance that Emily Heltenbacher was right and everyone else was wrong, maybe Charlie had been snuffed because one of his jokes had offended someone. Maybe he'd made a bad enemy and it didn't have anything to do with his manuscript at all. Not to mention blah, 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 hadn't had anything to do with his manuscript at all. I was pleased with this genuine detective-style thinking. Despite the misery of my long trudge home, I began to consider whether I should allow Emily, if she was suitably contrite, to rehire me. Charlie and I had been through a lot of good times before the bottom fell out. Maybe his daughter deserved a little patience. Not to mention that she owed me for at least one night's work. "Your girlfriend's on the phone," shouted Tilly. I put down my self-help bankruptcy book and unhurriedly picked up the receiver. I had known Emily would come crawling back, but I wasn't going to let her off too easily. "You still have my father's graduation photograph," she said in a tone like a whip crack. "Send it back immediately or I'll come over there and break your arm." She was playing it a little more cagily than I'd expected. "Don't hurt me," I said. "My health insurance lists attack by school teachers an act of God, and it'll be hell getting them to pay. Just send me the picture. Right now." I was sure I detected an undercurrent of playfulness in her voice, albeit well camouflaged. "How about if I drop it by in person? Then we can discuss last night's little difference of opinion. If you come within a mile of me, you're going to have to learn how to make balloon animals without your teeth." She hung up loudly enough to loosen a few of my fillings, but I knew I basically had her. Thus it was that after only a few dozen phone calls, and a slight strategic modification on my part, which might have been mistaken by some unschooled observers for a cringing apology, Emily Heltenbacher and I resumed our partnership. "Tell me their names again." She revved the engine, although the light was still resolutely red. I'd finally pinned down the other two mystery men, though through laborious research and various trade booking guides. Sandor Horjanagy, the Hungarian Houdini. He's the one we're going to see right now. The other's Gerard O'Neill. And just for your information, they were both doing shows on the night in question, just like Ivoni. 2 more airtight alibis. For goodness sake, Pinard, you're so unimaginative. We're talking about magicians. People who disappear and reappear elsewhere for a living. Honestly, if this were a murder mystery in a book, you'd be the idiot cop they always have stumbling around to make the detective look good. Thank you for your many kindnesses. I reached into my pocket for my cigarettes. Emily had finally tendered my retainer, and I had splurged on a whole carton. Whatever you may think, a stage magician nearing retirement age cannot disappear in the middle of a downtown performance, catch a cab to the suburbs, murder an old classmate, and be back before the audience notices. And he can't spin straw into gold or turn a pumpkin into a horse-drawn carriage either. Just in case you still harbor some misconceptions about what real magicians do. I leaned back and withdrew my new, top-of-the-line disposable lighter. "Don't you dare light that in my car. I don't want my upholstery smelling of smoke." Obviously, she had no similar problem with the scent of self-deceit and denial. I didn't say that, of course. Long years of working with the public had taught me that although the customer may not always be right, only a fool behaves otherwise before he's been paid in full. "Look," I said, "I'm just being sensible. You're a nice lady, Emily, but I think you're barking up the wrong tree. The police say it was an accident. The coroner said it was an accident. And all your suspects have alibis. When are you going to face up to what that really means?" She started an angry reply, but bit it off. She stayed silent for a long while, and even when the light finally turned green, she accelerated with none of her usual gusto. I was pleased that I had finally made her see sense, but not exactly happy about it, if you know what I mean. Sometimes when something goes very wrong, we humans desperately want there to be a reason. It's not fun being the person who takes that possibility away. "It's just not like my father," she said at last. "Suicide? Never. Not in a million years. So that leaves accident. But you knew him too, Pinard. You knew how carefully he planned everything." I had to admit that was true. Charlie work up an illusion was like watching Admiral Nimitz setting out his bath toys. No detail too small for obsessive consideration. "But sometimes even careful people get careless," I pointed out. "Or sometimes they just don't give a damn anymore. You told me he was having a real bad financial problem." "You are too, but I don't see you getting your throat slit." "Not when I've got a whole carton of cigarettes," I said cheerfully. "I prefer my suicides slow." "That's not very funny." I immediately felt bad. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Look, let's go see this Najee guy. Even if it turns out you're wrong about the murder angle, you'll feel better if you know for certain. She nodded, but didn't seem very convinced or very cheerful. She was even still driving in an uncharacteristically moderate way, so basically, nice guy that I am, I sang a medley of Burt Bacharach songs for her as we made our way across town. I've always thought that if magic hadn't worked out, I could have made a tidy bundle warbling, "Walk on by" in your better grade of dinner houses. It didn't jolly her up much. "I'll pay you the rest of tonight's fee right now if you shut up," was how she put it. Sándor Nagy, I think you're supposed to say Nagy Sándor with Hungarians, but for what I know for sure about their customs, you could write on the back of a postage stamp and still have room for your favorite goulash recipe. Sándor Nagy had seen better days. As a performer, our pal Ivoni was, by comparison, Elvis. We warmed the plastic chairs in the hallway of the Rotary Club while we waited for Nagy to finish changing his clothes in the men's room. The show had been interesting, if watching a drunk perform for a bunch of guys offended because the entertainer was more blasted than they were is the kind of thing that interests you. Partly out of pity, we took Nagy to the 24-hour coffee shop across the street and bought him a Grand Slam breakfast. There is no time in places like that, by the way, so you might as well eat breakfast. Actually, there is time, but only the waitresses experience it, which is why they're all about 104 years old. I've always thought someone should write a science fiction book about this paradox. "I'm not quite sure what went wrong with that trunk escape," Nagy said, or slurred, to be more precise. "Usually it works like a charm." After the grueling experience of his show, I had been planning to down a quick couple of beers. I wasn't going to drink club soda forever, just because I was hanging around with Ms. Ruler across the knuckles, but the old guy's breath and the bold yet intricate vein patterns on his nose persuaded me to order myself a Coke. Thus, I had my mouth wrapped around a straw and didn't have to comment. "I'm sure you would have got out eventually," said Emily. I didn't think they really needed to call the fire department. Nagy eyed his soft-boiled eggs with great sadness. I think he would much rather have had a couple of belts himself, but we had declined to buy him anything with a proof content. He wasn't real coherent as it was, even after all the oxygen the fire crew had forced into him. "I will let you in on a secret," he said. "I am not as sharp as I used to be. A step slower these days, if you know what I mean." "Well, you and my father were at the academy at the same time, weren't you? That was quite a way back." I smiled. Emily was showing definite improvement. All the same, interrogating this guy made about as much sense as bringing down a pigeon with a surface-to-air missile. If he was a murderer, I was Merlin. "Oh, that's right. You said you were Charlie Helton's kid. Shame about him. I heard he was writing a book. Wouldn't want to take time from my escape work myself. There's a lot of practice involved." He pushed one of his eggs with a fork, as though unsure whether to commit to something so strenuous as eating. "He was a strange one, your dad. Drove a lot of people crazy." "Did he? He made enemies?" Emily was leaning forward, giving the old guy that penetrating, "Would you like to share that with the class?" gaze that made me cringe even when it wasn't aimed at me. I refrained from pointing out that her elbow was in a puddle of ketchup, purely because I didn't want to disrupt her, of course. "Not enemies, no, not really." Sándor Nagy stopped to think, a process that clearly needed some ramping up time. It was a good half-minute before he came up with, he bragged a lot, told a lot of stories, played tricks on people." Now it was my turn to lean forward. My backfired prank theory was sounding better. "Anyone in particular that he upset?" Nagy shook his head. "Not that I could tell you. It's been a long time. He just pissed a lot of people off. Pardon my French, miss." I chewed on my straw, disgusted with myself for taking the idea of murder seriously for even a second. "Let me ask you another question," I said. Are you really Hungarian? Because I'm not sure that's the right accent. Najee frowned at me and squinted his bloodshot eyes. Starve Popeye the Sailor Man for a few weeks, then strap him into an extremely musty tux, and you basically had Najee. I sure as hell am. Both my parents from the old country, even if I ain't been there lately. At least I got family connection. One of those punks at the academy called himself Il Misterioso Giorgio, and he wasn't even Italian. Some chump kid from Weehawken. We left the Hungarian Houdini muttering angrily at his hash browns. I had mixed feelings when I got downstairs to the office the next day. I was more convinced than ever that we were wasting our time and that Emily, who was actually a pretty okay person, was going to get her feelings hurt. On the other hand, she'd paid me a nice little fee, and the story was playing big and bold in the tabloids. It wasn't front page in the Scrutinizer, but it was near the front, and a full-page spread to boot. There was an artist's rendition of The Death Basket, which included far more swords than were actually involved in Charlie's demise, a photo of Charlie in his stage outfit, and one of the coroner and the police chief at a news conference looking very serious. In fact, the photo had been taken during some other and far more important case, but I must admit it gave the thing an air of drama. The only item conspicuously missing was one of the publicity photos of yours truly I'd sent to them. There's no such thing as bad PR, especially when you've been stuck on the birthday party circuit for a few years. But I was mentioned prominently in all the articles, even if the Metropolitan managed to spell my name Pinrod. So all in all, it could have been worse. Emily didn't seem to think so, though. When I called her, she sounded tired and depressed. I'm beginning to think you're right, she said. Whatever was in the manuscript, it's gone. The tabloid reporters won't leave me alone. After I finish paying you, I'll be broke. My savings had gone on Dad's funeral. I think it's time to go fishing. Huh? I had a sudden and disconcerting vision of Emily in hip waders. It's just a family expression. When times are bad, when the bill collectors are after you, you say, I think I'll go fishing. And that's how I feel right now. I was still thinking about the hip waders. In a certain kind of way, they can be a pretty sexy garment. I suppose it has something to do with my reading Field and Stream too much during my adolescence. In any case, distracted as I was, I did a wildly foolish and uncharacteristic thing. Listen, Emily, I said, I don't want your money. What does that mean? She sounded angry. I mean, I don't want any more of your money, and you can have back what I haven't spent yet. But we'll still go see O'Neill this afternoon. On the house, okay? She didn't say anything right away. I assumed she'd been struck dumb by gratitude, but I wasn't sure. Charlie's daughter had proven herself a mite unpredictable. While I waited for the verdict, I re-scrutinized the Scrutinizer. It was too bad they hadn't run a picture of Emily, I thought. She was a very good-looking woman. I frowned. Something in the paper's coverage had been nagging at me since I'd read it. Some little connection I couldn't make that was now bidding heavily for my attention. But between certain thoughts of an imaginary Emily in a fishing gear pictorial, and then the sudden reappearance of the actual Emily's voice, the thought didn't have much of a chance. That's very kind of you, Dalton. You're really a nice person. She'd never called me by my first name before. That nagging detail was abruptly heckled off the amateur night stage of my consciousness. And you're a nice person too, Emily. I hung up, feeling oddly as though I might be blushing. Tilly was standing in my office doorway. She'd heard the whole conversation. Her expression of amused contempt was probably similar to what ancient Christians saw on the faces of Roman lions. Your gills are showing, Pinrod, she said. What an idiot. Hook, line, and sinker. I summoned up great reserves of her strength and ignored her. I spent all of O'Neill's performance trying to decide what Emily would do if I put my arm around her. I'd like to say we were paying close attention to the show, but we weren't. I'm reasonably certain that murder investigators don't date each other. Or that if they do, they keep the dates separate from the actual investigations. I hope so. Not that Jerry O'Neill's routine was the kind of thing that invited close attention. It was a mixture of old gags and fairly lame sleight of hand. Only the fact that it was a charity performance in front of a ward full of sick children made it something more than tiresome. And to be fair, the kids seemed to like it. O'Neill, it turned out, was the only one of the three who'd been on good terms with Charlie. He'd kept in loose touch with him over the years. As we walked him out to his car, O'Neill wiped the perspiration from his round face and walrus mustache and told us, with impressive sincerity, how upset he'd been when he heard the news. He was a good guy, Charlie was. A little loco sometimes, but basically a heart of gold. He stuffed several feet of colored kerchief back into his pocket and patted Emily's arm. You got my real best wishes, Missy. I was broken up to hear about it. Emily's questions were perfunctory. She seemed a lot more cheerful than she'd been on the phone, but she seemed to be losing interest in the investigation. I wasn't really surprised. It was pretty difficult to feature any of our three suspects as the Fu Manchu criminal mastermind type. When you say Charlie was a little loco sometimes, I asked, what do you mean? His practical jokes? O'Neill grinned. I heard about some of those. What a card. But I mostly meant his stories. He was full of stories, and some of them were pretty crazy. Like what? Oh, places he'd been, things he'd seen. He told me once he'd been in China, and some old guy there taught him how to talk to birds. Man, if you listen to him, he'd done everything. Snuck into a sultan's harem somewhere, hung out with voodoo priests in Haiti, tamed elephants in Thailand, you name it, crazy stories. Emily rose to her father's defense. He did travel quite a bit, Mr. O'Neill. He toured in a lot of places. Took his show all over the world. Asia, South America, the Caribbean. Especially when he was younger, he was a pretty big star. O'Neill was a gallant man. Then maybe all them stories were true, Missy. In any case, I'm sorry he's gone. He was a hell of a guy. We watched O'Neill drive off. As we strolled back across the parking lot, Emily took my hand. Maybe it was an accident, she said, and turned to look at me. The sunset brought out the deep gold colors in her hair. Maybe that stuff he wrote on the photo was just another of his stories or silly tricks. But at least I did my best to find out, she sighed. Talking to these people reminded me of all the parts of his life I missed out on. I didn't see a lot of him while I was growing up. I didn't say anything. I was concentrating on the feeling of her warm skin beneath my fingers and thinking about what I was about to do. I stopped, pulled her toward me, and carefully removed her glasses. Why, Miss Heltenbacher, I said as if in surprise. You're beautiful. Do you mind if I kiss you? She snatched them back and jammed them into place, brow furrowed in annoyance. I hate it when everything's blurry. Kiss me with my goddamn glasses on. What was it like? Do I have to tell you? Magic. I woke up in the middle of the night. The thing that had been bothering me had come back. Boy, had it ever come back. I ran downstairs to my office, not bothering with the bathrobe. This should show you how excited I was, even though Tilly lived on the other side of the town, wouldn't be in for hours, and the office was effectively part of my home. Going there naked, even at 4 a.m., made me feel queasily disrespectful. But the yammering in my brain wouldn't wait for anything. A few minutes later, I ran back upstairs and woke up Emily. Look, just because she was a school teacher doesn't mean you should make old-fashioned assumptions. Get up! Get up! I was literally jumping up and down. What the hell is going on, Pinard? She sat up, rubbing her eyes and looking utterly gorgeous. After the night we just spent, I wasn't at all worried about her use of my last name. I've solved it! And you're never going to believe it. I grabbed her arm, almost dragging her toward the stairs. She very firmly pulled free and went to get her glasses from the bedside table. Next, and clearly second in order of importance, she found my bathrobe and put it on. In a gesture of solidarity, I pulled my underwear off the ceiling light. Don't ask. Donned it and led her to the office. Brace yourself, I said. This is very weird. I took a breath, trying to think of the best way to explain. First of all, you were right. It wasn't an accident. Emily sat up straight. Somebody did murder him? A strange look came over her face. Or are you going to tell me it was suicide? I was suddenly reluctant. Waking someone up in the middle of the night to give them the kind of news I was about to give Emily could have a number of shocking effects, and I felt very protective of her and of what we suddenly seemed to have together. Well, see for yourself. I spread the copy of the Scrutinizer on the desktop, then laid the graduation picture on top of it. Something was bothering me about this article, but with everything else that happened today, well, I sort of forgot about it. Then, about 15 minutes ago, I woke up and I knew. I pointed at the picture, at one of the faces that Charlie hadn't circled. See this kid? You know who that is? Emily stared, then shook her head. That's Il Misterioso Giorgio, the one Najee mentioned. You know, the fake Italian from Weehawken? I still don't get it. You will. Remember Fabrizio Ivoni talking about those delinquent friends of your dad's who didn't graduate the academy? Well, he was wrong. One of them did. It was young Giorgio here, although he never made it as a working magician. How do you know that? I lifted the graduation picture and pointed to the Scrutinizer, because he would have had trouble being a stage magician and holding down the job of chief coroner. I put the graduation picture beside the news photo for comparison. Meet Il Misterioso Giorgio today, George Bridgewater. She stared at the two photos, then looked up at me. My God, I think you're right. But I still don't understand. What does it mean? Did he cover up something after my dad's death? This was the hard part. Suddenly, under the bright fluorescent lights, my certainty had dwindled. It would be unutterably cruel if I turned out to be wrong. I took her hand. Emily, I said, I think your dad's alive. She pulled away from me, stepping back as though I'd slapped her. The tears that suddenly formed in her eyes made me want to slap myself. What are you saying? That's crazy. Look, you said it yourself. Charlie'd never be a suicide. And he wasn't the type to have an accident. But you said he'd traveled in the Caribbean, and he told O'Neill he'd studied with voodoo priests. They have chemicals they use in voodoo that make people look like they're dead. That's where the zombie legends come from. It's true. I read about it. She laughed, angry, frightened. Where? In Astrology and Detective Gazette? In a science magazine. Emily, they've done studies. Voodoo priests can use this stuff to put people in a kind of temporary coma. All the vital signs disappear. No paramedic struggling to keep your dad alive would know the difference. Not if he'd made a real but shallow cut and spread a lot of blood around. It wouldn't even have to be human blood, since nobody would think of testing it when he was locked in a room by himself with a key in his pocket. But you'd have to have a confederate in place for later, because nobody could live through a real autopsy. Chief coroners hardly ever do actual examinations, so it's a little bit of a coincidence he was writing that report at all. Even weirder that he wouldn't step aside when he found out the dead guy was an old school chum. So this guy Bridgewater helped my dad fake his own death? Why? Who knows? A last prank for old time's sake, maybe? You said your dad was depressed and broke. Maybe it was a way for Giorgio the Mysterious to help a pal get out of a bad situation. I didn't want to mention it, but it was also possible that the deal had been a little less friendly. Old Charlie, collector of gossip and odd stories, might have had a wee bit of blackmail material on Bridgewater. Emily stared at the pictures. When she turned back to me, she was calmer, but very grim. I don't think you did this to be cruel, she said. But this is so much more far-fetched than anything I suggested. It's just crazy. I had a sick feeling in my stomach, kind of like something very cold was hibernating there. I knew I'd blown it. But she cut me off, her voice rising in anger. I can almost believe my father would do something this wild, this outrageous. Heaven knows he loved a good trick, and he was having a lot of problems. But I can't for a moment believe that he would make me think he was dead, with not even a hint that he'd survived, and then on top of it send me off to hook up with a bum like you and go on some insane hunt for a non-existent murderer. She waved a picture in front of my face. Look at this. This is his handwriting. If he wanted to tip me off, why didn't he circle Bridgewater, the coroner? Instead, he picks these three totally harmless. I was so far into my flinch that at first I didn't open my eyes. When she had remained silent for a good 10 seconds, I peeked. Emily was still frowning, but it was a different kind of frown. "Oh, God," she said at last. She flopped the photo down so the back was showing. I had written down the men's names as I identified them. Gerard O'Neill. Emily's voice was strained. Fabrizio Ivoni. Shandor Horja Naji. Oh my God. What? Look at the initials. Gonfishn. The tears came for real now. Gone fishing. There was a good deal more to the story, of course, but we didn't find out immediately. When we went to see Bridgewater, the coroner blustered at us about foolish accusations and the penalties for slander, but he didn't seem very fierce about it. We later discovered that one of Charlie's Academy-era jokes had yielded photographs of a naked Giorgio in bed with a sheep dressed in a garter belt. It had all been perfectly innocent, of course, but still not the kind of thing a local politician wants to see on the wire services. Still, it was a few more months before we knew for sure. Apparently, Charlie Helton did have an agent. Emily hadn't known about. A theatrical agent, but someone who had contacts in publishing. When at the height of the tabloid fury about the murdered magician mystery, the agent announced that he actually had the dead man's manuscript, it set off a bidding war, and the book sold for a very healthy advance. As Charlie's only heir, Emily received all but a small part of what was left after the agent took his cut. When the book quickly earned back its advance, she began to receive all but that same small percentage of the royalties that began flowing in. Even after the story lost its tabloid notoriety, A Magical Life continued to sell nicely. As it turned out, Charlie had written quite a good book, full of vivid stories about his life and travels, and lots of enjoyable but not too scurrilous backstage gossip about the world of stage magicians. Even Fabrizio Ivoni didn't come out too bad in Charlie's memoirs, although his inability to take a joke was mentioned several times. That small portion of income that Emily didn't get? Well, every month the agent dispatches a check to a post office box in Florida. No, I won't tell you where exactly, just in Florida somewhere. Suffice it to say, it's a small town with good fishing. The checks are made out to someone named Booker H. Charlton. Emily decided not to contest this diversion of royalties, and in fact, we plan to go visit old Booker as soon as we can get out of town. Why delay our visit to the mystery fisherman? Well, we've been real busy just lately setting up the Charlie Helton Museum of the Magical Arts. It's turned out to be a full-time job for all of us. Emily took early retirement from the school system to manage the operation, and Tilly answers the phones and handles the finances, which, I am happy to say, are in the black. Tilly's mom works the ticket booth, flashing her expensive smile at the customers all day long. Me? Well, I've got the balloon animal concession pretty much wrapped up, and I'm working on a book of my own. Oh, and in case anybody's disappointed that this has been a story about magicians without any real magic in it, I should mention one last thing. You remember how Charlie had scrawled on the back of his photo, "Trust Pinardo"? We found out a few months afterward that if Charlie's handwriting had been a little darker, we would have noticed a hyphen between the two words. See, we were going through some of his papers and found out that he'd stashed away a couple of $100 so Emily wouldn't get stuck paying for his fake funeral. The deposit was in a trust fund at a small savings institution. Pinardo Thrift and Loan. No relation to yours truly. In other words, the very beautiful woman, who I am delighted to say now calls herself Ms. Emily Helton Bacher Pinard, the light of my life and, I hope, the warmth of my declining years, walked into my office that day on a completely mistaken assumption. We are an accident, a fluke of fate. So there you go. Love, as Bogart once said about a blackbird and Shakespeare said about something I don't quite remember, is definitely the stuff that dreams are made of. It remains the greatest mystery and the only truly reliable magic. Satisfied? And that is the end of the story. And we've gone a little bit past 8. We've gone to 8:15. So I think rather than, okay. Well, I am going to, first of all, thank you for your patience. I'm going to check for another few questions and see if anybody has some. And then I'm going to wind it down and go find something to eat. So I have a question from my friend Jerry, who says, what's currently on your reading list, if anything, when you're not writing? My reading lists tend to be very heavy with nonfiction. I do have one book I've been really looking forward to, which is Hilary Mantel's third book of the Thomas Cromwell series, of which they've been making a brilliant TV series with Mark Rylance. And so, but I'm not reading that right at the moment, just because I know how it's going to end, and it's going to be depressing, and so I'm not in that kind of a mood right now. But as usual, I'm reading a lot of nonfiction. So I have some very good books on Neolithic England that I'm working my way through, and various other kind of strange CAD type books on science and history, things that fascinate me. But I'm kind of holding off. Oh, and I started War and Peace, but at the moment I'm holding off on the Hilary Mantel book until I'm ready. Question from Alexis. Have you ever drunk Bailey's out of a shoe? Creamy beige. Thank you, Alexis. No, I have never drunk Bailey's out of a shoe. However, I have drunk flat stout out of a Doc Martin. So that's probably close enough. And let me see what else we've got here, if there's any other questions. Question, will there eventually be another Savage Roger album? I have no idea. My friends and I haven't played together in a while. So if that changes, I will certainly let you know. I always get the itch, but whether anybody else much wants to have that itch scratched, I'm not sure. So I don't see any other questions at the moment. So let me start wrapping up. It's lovely to have all of you tune in, whether you are regular TAD friends from Facebook or Twitter or elsewhere. And I will continue doing this on Sunday. I will probably also do one very late at night next Saturday, very early Sunday morning, so that some European friends can have a chance to hear. In the meantime, I just want to say I hope you are all of you who need to, I hope you are sheltering in place, which should be most of you. Because again, it's not just for yourself, it's for all the other people who are vulnerable to COVID-19 and to respiratory viruses and things like that. We have, as I've mentioned, a few in my own household here. And so it's to everybody's advantage to do the boring thing of trying to stay away and not spread viruses. But I also want to say, keep doing things you love doing as much as you can. Get out of the house, read stories, make up stories, play board games, whatever it is. Because I need you, Deb needs you, we both need you. You are not just our audience, not just the people who help us make a living, but you are our friends as well. So you're all important to us. So take care, be well, stay well. Thank you for joining me tonight, and I will see you this time next week at the very latest, if not earlier. So again, thank you.